Number 3. Patricia Stallings. In the summer of 1989, the Stallings family lived in Hillsborough, Missouri, a small city about 40 miles south of St. Louis. 27-year-old David Stallings and his 24-year-old wife, Patricia, went by Patty, had a 3-month-old son, Ryan. David and Patty met 3 years earlier in 1986. Patty was working at a convenience store, and David lived across the road from the store. He asked her out several times, but she said no. Finally, close to the end of 1986, she agreed to go out with him. They were married in August 1988. Ryan was born in April 1989. On the second weekend of July 1989, Ryan was vomiting a lot. On the Sunday, which was July 9th, 1989, he was having problems breathing. Patty decided to bring him to the hospital. She planned to go to the St. Louis Children's Hospital. However, she got lost on the drive from Hillsborough and ended up at Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital in St. Louis. Ryan was placed in the pediatric intensive care unit. 2 independent labs conducted tests, and they found high levels of ethylene glycol, the active ingredient in antifreeze, in Ryan's blood. The doctors believed Ryan had been poisoned. 3 days after Ryan was admitted to the hospital, David and Patty got good news and bad news. The doctors believed that Ryan would make a full recovery, but the police were investigating them for poisoning Ryan. On July 17, 1989, when Ryan was discharged from the hospital, he was placed in foster care. Patty and David were allowed to visit him once a week for an hour. For 5 weeks, there were no problems. On September 5, 1989, 5 days after the last visit, 24-year-old Patty Stallings was arrested for assault. 3.5 days after their 6th visit, Ryan once again was sick with ethylene glycol poisoning. His levels were higher than the first time he was admitted to the hospital. On September 7, 1989, 2 days after Patty was arrested, 5-month-old Ryan died. Patty was charged with his murder. The police continued to investigate the death. On September 1, 1989, during their hour visit, the police believed that Patty was left alone with Ryan for 5 to 8 minutes. During that time, she fed him a bottle. The bottle was tested, and traces of ethylene glycol were found in the bottle. David was adamant that Patty didn't poison Ryan during the visit. He said that Patty was alone for about 45 seconds at most. When he returned to the room, he got the bottle and didn't see or smell anything wrong with it. Then he was the one who fed the baby. The police found 2 containers of antifreeze under the pool table in the basement of the Stallings home. One thing the police learned was that Ryan was not Patty's first child. She had a 5-year-old who was in the custody of her sister. She lost custody because the child was found to be malnourished and in the first stages of frostbite. Patty said, at the time, she couldn't properly care for the child because she was unhoused. In the lead up to her trial, Patty was held in jail. While in jail, she learned that she was 3 months pregnant. She gave birth to a son, David Jr., or DJ, in February 1990 while still in custody. The child was immediately put into foster care, even though David was never charged in connection with Ryan's death. 2 weeks after DJ was born, while he was in foster care, he started experiencing the same symptoms as Ryan. DJ was taken to the St. Louis Children's Hospital, the hospital Patty originally wanted to take Ryan to. DJ was diagnosed with methylaminic acidemia, also known as MMA. MMA is a rare group of genetic disorders that affects the liver. People with MMA can't properly break down proteins and fats because they don't produce an enzyme. After DJ was diagnosed, the district attorney George B. McElroy III, started to have doubts of his own, so Patty was released on bond, which is very rare in a murder trial in Missouri. However, McElroy still proceeded with the charges for 3 reasons. The first was that MMA does not cause high levels of ethylene glycol in the blood. Secondly, during Ryan's autopsy, calcium oxalate crystals, a symptom of ethylene glycol poisoning, were found in his brain. Third, ethylene glycol was found in the bottle that Patty was left alone with and Ryan drank from. Patty's lawyer claims he looked for an expert to testify that David died of MMA, but he couldn't find one. No one would testify that MMA caused ethylene glycol poisoning. Patricia Stallings went to trial in January 1991. The case seemed airtight for the prosecution. According to experts, Ryan was poisoned with ethylene glycol, and the bottle Patty fed him contained traces of ethylene glycol. Patty had also been left alone with Ryan and the bottle 3 days before Ryan became terminally ill. Patty's defense tried to argue that Ryan died as a result of MMA, but the judge chastised him because there was no evidence of that. The trial lasted 2 days, and the jury deliberated for 10 hours. Patricia Stallings was found guilty. She was sentenced to life without the chance of parole. But the conviction didn't sit right with everyone. In May 1991, the television program Unsolved Mysteries aired a segment about Ryan's death. Dr. William S. Sly, professor and chairman of the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology at St. Louis University, watched the show that night. He believed he knew what happened. MMA can cause high levels of propionic acid. Propionic acid is often mistaken for ethylene glycol because they are very similar. The difference between them is 1 carbon atom. At the time, chemicals were identified by graph printouts from tests that were compared by eye to graphs of chemical signatures. The graphs of ethylene glycol and propionic acid are incredibly similar. But if you superimpose them, then the difference is noticeable. Dr. Sly gave a sample of Ryan's blood to Dr. James Shoemaker, director of metabolic screening at St. Louis University, so that he could test the blood. Dr. Shoemaker confirmed that Ryan had high levels of propionic acid in his blood, so his death was most likely the result of MMA. To confirm that there might have been a mistake from the labs, he spiked a blood sample with propionic acid and sent it to 7 labs. 3 reported high levels of ethylene glycol, even though there was none in the blood samples. On June 28, 1991, Dr. Sly sent a letter to the Executive Associate Vice President of St. Louis University. In the letter, he stated that Ryan had died of MMA. The letter was then handed over to District Attorney George McElroy. Around the same time, Patty's new lawyer filed an appeal citing ineffectual counsel. McElroy agreed with the appeal, and he wanted Patty to get a new trial. This was incredibly surprising. Circuit Court Judge Gary P. Kramer said, quote, "This is the first time I have ever known this to happen. It's unheard of for a prosecutor to acknowledge ineffective counsel," unquote. On July 29, 1991, Judge Kramer granted Patty a new trial, and she was released on bond the next day. After Patty was released, McElroy met with Dr. Piero Rinaldo, an expert on genetic diseases at Yale University. Dr. Rinaldo confirmed the findings from St. Louis University. Ryan had high levels of propionic acid in his blood caused by MMA, and it contributed to his death. Dr. Rinaldo also had explanations for the other 2 pieces of evidence, the crystals in the brain and the ethanol glycol in the bottle. When Ryan was in the hospital, because the hospital staff thought he was suffering from ethanol glycol poisoning, they put him on an ethanol drip. Unfortunately, this was the wrong treatment for high levels of propionic acid, and it likely contributed to his death. The ethanol drip caused the crystals in the brain. As for the bottle, Dr. Ronaldo tested it and found no traces of ethanol glycol. He pointed out that after the bottle was used, it was washed. This could have led to traces of ethanol glycol being found. In September 1991, George McElroy dropped the charges against Patty Stallings, and he apologized to her. Patty had spent about 2 years incarcerated. Patty sued Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital, the 2 labs that did the blood tests, and several doctors. She settled out of court for millions. After Patty was released, she and David got custody of DJ. He was on a special diet and did other treatments for his MMA. Patty and David later divorced. Tragically, DJ Stallings died in September 2013 at age 23. His cause of death and if MMA contributed to it is unknown. David Stallings died in April 2019 at age 57 after a long illness. Patty's status is unknown. She would be about 58 years old at the time of this video. Number 2. Michelle Murphy. In September 1994, 17-year-old Michelle Murphy lived in a townhouse in Tulsa, Oklahoma with her 2 children, 2-year-old Lindsay and 15-week-old Travis. She had split up with the children's father, Harold Eugene Wood, who went by Gene, earlier in the year. She wanted Gene to get his life together and get a job to support his family. Around 6:15 a.m. on September 12, 1994, Michelle ran to a neighbor's home screaming, quote, "I think my baby is dead," unquote. The police were called. While Michelle waited for the police, her neighbors saw that she was very emotional. When the police arrived, they found her on the porch, crying and smoking a cigarette. In the kitchen, the police found something out of a nightmare. On the kitchen floor was the dead body of 15-week-old Travis. His throat was slit nearly to the point of decapitation. He had also been stabbed once in the chest. However, the stab wound wasn't noticeable because of the blood. It was only found when the pathologist was cleaning the body. Michelle was taken to the police station and interviewed by Detective Mike Hook. Michelle explained that she had been having issues with a neighbor, LaDonna Summers. Michelle said that after she and Gene split up, she started seeing another man, Earl Peck. A few weeks earlier, Michelle said that Summers told her she thought that the baby looked like Earl. LaDonna Summers then started telling people that Peck was the father of Travis. Michelle said that wasn't possible because she only met Peck after Travis was born. About a week and a half before the murder, a girl who lived in the complex made a joke that implied Peck was the father, and Peck heard the joke. Michelle explained to him that Summers was telling people he was the father of Travis. Peck got mad and told off Summers. Michelle said that later that day, Summers came to her home and they had an argument. Michelle said that Summers then threatened her and said she would get her when she was all by herself. Michelle told Detective Cook that on the night of the murder, it had been hot, so she and the 2 children were sleeping downstairs on an L-shaped couch near the window air conditioning unit. Early on the morning of the murder, Michelle was awoken by someone knocking on the door. She said she opened the door and LaDonna Summers stormed in. She said that Summers started screaming at her. This woke up Travis, and Michelle thought she had brought Travis into the kitchen. Michelle told Detective Cook several times that she had been hit in the head, and her memory around the time of the murder was cloudy. Detective Cook asked Michelle if anyone was with Summers, and Michelle said she couldn't remember. She said that she was either holding Travis or Summers was holding him. She thinks there was a struggle over Travis and the baby fell to the kitchen floor. Around this time, she also hit her head. She thought she may have been hit with a steel bar or she was pushed and she hit her head. Michelle said that in the past she would run upstairs to the bathroom and lock the door whenever she got scared. She said she did that after she hit her head and Travis fell to the floor. She kept a kitchen knife in the upstairs hallway in case she needed to protect herself. She picked up the knife and then chased LaDonna Summers out of her home. Michelle said that after Summers left, she went to the kitchen where Travis was laying on the floor. Michelle said that she wasn't paying attention to how long the knife was. She bent over too fast and she accidentally cut Travis's throat. She then dropped the knife on him. She said, quote, "I could have been so angry that I needed to take it out on somebody and ended up hurting my son," unquote. She then took the knife and threw it down a sewer grate behind her home. After the confession, 17-year-old Michelle Murphy was arrested. The police continued to investigate the murder. It turned out that around 3 a.m., 3 hours before the police were called to Michelle's home about the murder, an anonymous phone call was made from a payphone near her home. The caller reported a noisy argument at Michelle's townhouse. There are two different accounts about what happened when the police responded. One account says that the officers went to the townhouse and knocked on the door, which was partially open. No one answered, so they entered. On the couch, they saw Michelle and her daughter sleeping. They tried to wake Michelle, but they couldn't. They did not see Travis. Other reports say that the officers found no signs of a disturbance and left without entering the home. During the investigation into Travis's murder, the police talked to the neighbors. One of them said that around 3 a.m. he had an argument with his girlfriend, so he had stepped outside. He saw 14-year-old William Lee run across his complex to his own home. The police questioned William, and he initially denied being out of his family's home that night. He then admitted he was the one who called 911. He said he couldn't sleep, so he went for a walk. William said that he heard an argument happening in Michelle's home, so he looked at Michelle's front window. He said that he saw her fighting with the father of the children, Gene Wood. He said that Gene had a kitchen knife in his back pocket. He told the dispatcher he heard what sounded like a knife being thrown against a wall. William then had more information for the police. He said that he checked on Michelle around 4:30 a.m., about 90 minutes after he made the call. He said he looked in the front window and saw Michelle carrying the baby into the kitchen. Then it was quiet. He went to the back of her townhouse and looked through the kitchen window. The problem was that the blinds were closed, but he said he saw through the holes in the blinds. He said that Travis was on the floor in a pool of blood. He said he had neck and chest wounds. He also saw blood on Michelle's arms. He then went home and did not call the police. Michelle Murphy went to trial in November 1995. The main evidence against her was her confession. William Lee, who claimed he saw Michelle argue with her estranged boyfriend and called 911 about an argument between the two, and also said he saw Michelle with blood on her arms and Travis lying in a pool of blood, could not testify. On January 12, 1995, he was found dead, hanging from a bedsheet tied to a rafter in his family's garage. He had died from autoerotic asphyxiation. He was 15 years old. Instead, Williams' recorded testimony from the preliminary hearing was entered into evidence. LaDonna Summers testified, and she said she wasn't at Michelle's home the morning of the murder. She also testified that she knew that Earl Peck was not Travis's father. Scott Ritchie, a friend of Gene Wood's, testified. Ritchie said that about a month after the murder, Gene said he had been at Michelle's home that night. He said that Gene told Michelle to get rid of Travis and he would move back in with her. However, Gene testified he was not at Michelle's home that night. He was with several friends and they verified his alibi. The defense presented an alternative suspect. They believe that 14-year-old William Lee committed the murder. They pointed out he had lied to the police several times. He initially denied being out of the house on the night of the murder. He then told the police 3 other stories about what happened that night. He then admitted to making the 911 call about the noisy argument where he claimed he saw Jean Wood arguing with Michelle. About 90 minutes later, he saw the baby lying in a pool of blood with a slit throat and a chest wound, and Michelle had blood on her. The first problem is that Jean testified that he was not there that night, and the police confirmed his alibi. Michelle did tell Detective Cook that there was an argument around the time William called the police. She had been arguing with LaDonna Summers. Another problem was that William claimed he looked through the kitchen window and saw Travis dead on the floor. One odd thing he said was that the baby had a chest wound, but that wound wasn't even visible to officers at the crime scene. That wound was found by the pathologist. Yet William claimed he saw the wound through the window with the blinds down. Also, William said that he saw blood on Michelle, but the police did not find a single speck of blood on Michelle. Also, no blood was found in any of the sinks or the shower, so there's no evidence she cleaned it off. By many accounts, William was a troubled young man. School officials said they had problems telling the truth. He also got violent when he got frustrated. He had a disturbing history of violence. One time, he assaulted a teacher. He also decapitated a neighborhood cat. William also had romantic feelings for Michelle, but she had rebuffed his sexual advances. One time, after she rejected him, he got angry and grabbed her. Also, William's story didn't make much sense. Why did he call 911 after the fight, but he didn't call after seeing the baby in a pool of blood? If Michelle's lawyer could have questioned William, he could have picked apart his story and shown that he was a troubled teenager. But since William was dead, he could not be cross-examined. The defense couldn't even reveal details that showed William was a troubled young man. The prosecutor, Tim Harris, said no evidence proved William committed the crime. Harris said that Michelle killed Travis because he complicated her life too much. Ann Morris, a lab analyst with the Tulsa Police Department, testified. Morris said that blood from 2 people was found at the crime scene. Most was on the kitchen floor, but there was also blood on the drape that hung between the kitchen and the living room and outside the front door. One was an undetermined blood type, and the other was type AB. Morris believed that the undetermined blood was the baby's blood. She said that the red blood cells had died, and that's why she could not determine the blood type. She said the blood could have degraded because of environment, temperature, or bacteria. She said it's possible that she could not have determined the blood type because she said antibodies in infants don't develop until around 6 months. This was later determined to be scientifically incorrect. The AB type blood was found in 2 places, including outside the door, so Morris believed it was the killer's blood. In his closing arguments, the prosecutor, Tim Harris, implied that the type AB blood was Michelle's blood. He also showed the jury a knife that was found in a pile of clothes on the bed in Michelle's home. The trial lasted 5 days, and the jury deliberated for 5 hours. They found Michelle guilty of murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. Her daughter, Lindsay, was adopted. In early 2005, the Oklahoma Indigenous Defense System, also known as the OIDS, took on Michelle's case. There were many problems with her conviction. A major problem was the confession. Even though Michelle was the mother of 2, she was only 17 years old, meaning she was a minor. She only had an 8th grade education. A legal guardian should have been in the same room while she was being questioned. Michelle complained several times that she had a headache because she had hit her head. She also said that she had suffered memory loss. Detective Mike Hook said that he inspected her head and he did not see any injuries. He never took her to the hospital to be examined. Another problem is that Michelle was questioned for about 6 hours, but only 26 minutes were recorded. During those 26 minutes, she confessed. As Michelle's lawyer pointed out during the trial, the confession did not match what happened during the murder. Michelle said that it was an accident, but it was clear that someone intentionally cut Travis's throat. Michelle claimed that during the interrogation, Detective Cook yelled at her and told her they both knew she was the killer. Michelle said she only came up with a story about accidentally hurting Travis because she was tired and desperate to see her daughter. After all, she had experienced the traumatic event of losing her baby in a horrific way and saw his dead body in a pool of blood. What mother wouldn't want to see and hold their living child after that? Another problem was Detective Mike Cook. On January 25, 1995, shortly after William Lee's death, he requested that the crime lab test William's blood for type. The crime lab and the district attorney's office claimed they never got the request. Cook never followed up. So William's blood wasn't tested for type. This was odd because William was a troubled young man with a history of violence, and he would get violent when he was frustrated, and he had been rejected sexually by Michelle. He also had a bizarre story about the morning of the murder that didn't make much sense. Why wouldn't Detective Cook follow up and ask for the results? William wasn't the only problematic witness. Another witness who was a problem was Scott Ritchie. He claimed that Michelle's former boyfriend, Gene Wood, said he was at Michelle's home on the night of the murder. He said that Gene told Michelle they could get back together if she got rid of Travis. But there are several problems with Ritchie's testimony. The first is that Michelle broke up with Gene. She wanted him to become more responsible and get a job to support the family. If he did that, she would break up with her old pack and let him move back in. Secondly, Ritchie had a criminal record and stayed at least 3 times in a psychiatric hospital. Ritchie's background information was kept a secret from Michelle's lawyer. Another major problem was the blood evidence. As previously mentioned, no blood was found on Michelle, and there was no evidence that she had washed it off anywhere. The only places the blood was found were on the kitchen floor, the drape between the living room and the kitchen, and outside the front door. How did Michelle manage to slit Travis's throat, stab him in the chest, and then dispose of the weapon without getting any blood on her or anywhere else in the house? After all, the murder weapon was never found. Prosecutor Tim Harris showed the jury a knife that was found in Michelle's home, but it was not the murder weapon. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation did a report on the blood, but it was only made available the day before the trial. There was no explanation why it took over a year to do the testing. A major, glaring problem in the report greatly benefited the prosecution. The report said that Michelle's blood type was consistent with type A, but her blood grouping could not be determined. This was incredibly odd because Michelle was in jail in the 14 months leading up to her trial. So why couldn't they determine her blood type? By the mid-1990s, the test for blood type had been around for nearly 60 years. Plus, Michelle had medical records. After all, she had given birth to 2 children. Her medical records had her blood type. Michelle had type A blood. The lab analyst and more said she could not determine Travis's blood type, but the second blood type that was found at the crime scene was AB. This means that Michelle's blood was not found at the crime scene. District Attorney Tim Harris received the blood report from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation the day before the trial, but he did not submit it as evidence. He claims he showed the report to Michelle's defense lawyer, and Michelle's lawyer denies this. Harris also didn't have the author of the report testify. The vagueness of the report allowed Harris to imply that Michelle's blood was found at the crime scene. She has type A blood, so it is consistent with AB, just like someone with type B is consistent. But AB is a whole other blood group from A and B. Had Michelle's correct blood type been entered into evidence, it could have created reasonable doubt, because the victim's blood was found, and type AB blood was found, but no type A blood was found. In May 2005, nearly 10 years after Michelle was convicted, a judge ordered that the blood be tested for DNA. At the time, District Attorney Tim Harris was asked by the Tulsa World what he thought about the DNA testing. He said he was not worried because he knew Michelle was guilty. 3 envelopes that were supposed to contain blood samples were sent from the Tulsa Police Department to the private DNA lab. 2 of the envelopes were empty, and there's no explanation as to why. The blood sample in the 3rd envelope was tested. It was determined to be Travis's blood, which was type O. The results were sent to Tim Harris, who did not respond to them. The OIDS ended up dropping Michelle's appeal because the only testing the blood found was Travis's blood, and this did not exonerate her. A DNA profile was not made from the type AB blood, which was believed to have been the killer's blood. In the fall of 2013, Tim Harris announced that he would not be seeking re-election. In January 2014, the Innocence Project filed an appeal to have the DNA tested again. In May 2014, they got the results. None of the blood was Michelle Murphy's. The DNA belonged to the victim, Travis, and the other blood, the type AB, belonged to an unknown man. The most obvious suspect was 14-year-old William Lee. However, his DNA did not match either. In May 2014, Michelle's lawyers subpoenaed District Attorney Tim Harris and other investigators to testify at an evidentiary hearing. Days afterward, Harris had Michelle's conviction vacated. After 20 years, 37-year-old Michelle Murphy was released on bond. Harris said that the subpoena had nothing to do with his decision to vacate the conviction. He decided to vacate it because he had discovered the DNA report from 2005. He claimed he only learned of his existence earlier that year. However, the Tulsa World had him on record in 2005 saying he knew that the testing was being done. Then, in September 2014, the day before Harris was supposed to testify, he dropped the charges because he said that there was a lack of evidence. The judge dismissed the charges with prejudice so Michelle could never be tried again, and he declared her innocent. However, Harris said that he was sure Michelle was guilty. He just did not have enough evidence to try her again. The same day the charges were dropped, Harris secretly had the judge seal the court documents in the case. Harris said the documents were protected under client-attorney privilege. In this case, his client was the state. A hearing was scheduled a month later because Michelle's lawyers wanted the documents unsealed. Once again, Tim Harris was subpoenaed to testify. The district attorney's office filed a motion to keep him off the stand. A hearing about the status of the documents was held on October 31, 2014, but no one testified. The judge ruled that the documents would remain sealed. In September 2015, Michelle filed a lawsuit against the city of Tulsa, but was dismissed in 2018. She appealed, but the decision was upheld. She appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States, and they ultimately decided not to hear her case. For the 20 years Michelle Murphy spent in prison, wrongly convicted of killing her 15-week-old son, she received $175,000 from the state of Oklahoma. In May 2018, Michelle was reunited with her daughter during an episode of the television show The Doctors. Michelle's daughter, Lindsay, said she grew up having nightmares about Michelle murdering her brother. She always believed her mother was guilty and admitted that she still thought that. Michelle said that she understood. We have found no update on their relationship since then. In April 2017, Tim Harris ran for Congress in Oklahoma as a Republican, but lost in the primary runoff. In 2022, Harris ran on a far-right platform for the Tulsa School Board. He was not successful in his bid. He's currently the chief counsel for Tulsa County Sheriff's Office. The murder of Travis Wood is officially unsolved. Number 1. Jerry Hobbs. May 9, 2005 was Mother's Day in the United States. That afternoon, 8-year-old Laura Hobbs and her best friend, 9-year-old Crystal Tobias, rode their bikes together in Zion, Illinois. Zion, which is close to the Wisconsin border, had a population of about 23,000 people. When the girls didn't come home, their families searched for them. At 8:50, about 2 hours after they should have arrived home, they were reported missing. The police launched a search right away, but Laura and Crystal were not found that night. The next morning, Jerry Hobbs and his father-in-law searched Balula Park, close to their home. Behind some bushes in the ravine, the father-in-law saw a child's bike. Jerry searched the area and found the dead bodies of Laura and Crystal. Both girls were fully clothed. They had been beaten and stabbed multiple times. The police were immediately suspicious of Jerry. He had just moved to the area a few weeks earlier. Jerry lived in Texas a few years earlier with his girlfriend and their children, which included Laura. Jerry had been convicted of aggravated assault after he chased a man whom he considered a romantic rival with a chainsaw. He ended up serving 2 years in prison. Jerry had moved to Zion to reconnect with his family. About 90 minutes after Jerry found the bodies, he was questioned by the police. Besides knowing about his criminal record, the police were also suspicious of him because he had found the bodies. They thought it was odd that someone new to the area, instead of someone who was local, had found the bodies. Also, the police didn't think that Jerry was emotional. Over the next 24 hours, Jerry was questioned. For many hours, he denied having anything to do with the murders. After staying up all night, he confessed to killing Laura and Crystal. He said he wanted to fetch Laura and bring her home, but she was defiant and refused to leave the park. Then both girls attacked him. Crystal was armed with a knife, but he managed to take it from her. He said that he beat and stabbed them. Jerry said, quote, "Things just got out of hand and I lost it," unquote. He then signed the confession. Based on the confession, 34-year-old Jerry Hobbs was charged with 2 counts of murder. The state's attorney's office, which is the name used in Illinois for the prosecution, announced that they would be seeking the death penalty. Not long after, Jerry Hobbs recanted his confession. He said he was exhausted and broken, so he just told the police what they wanted to hear. He figured that since he was innocent, the truth would come out. However, Jerry Hobbs stayed in jail awaiting trial for the next 2.5 years. Then, in November 2008, Jerry's lawyers filed to get the charges dismissed. They had the evidence tested for DNA. This included the girls' clothes and vaginal, rectal, and oral swabs. Semen was found on Laura Hobbs' jean skirt and all the swabs from her body. This was notable because in Jerry's confession, which was the only evidence against him, he did not talk about sexual assault. A DNA profile was created. It was not Jerry's DNA. Assistant State's Attorney Michael Mermel said his office knew that the DNA wasn't Jerry's a year earlier. He said it did not matter because the DNA did not prove Jerry's innocence. He thought that there was another way the semen got onto Laura's skirt and into her 3 orifices. For example, she was found in a place where people went to have sex and she could have been playing around and got the semen on her. Mermel also said that the DNA was not found inside Laura's body. But this was not factual because it was found on the swabs. Regardless, Mermel refused to dismiss the charges. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS. At the time, no match was found. 2 years later, in June 2010, the police were notified that a match had been found. It was the DNA of 31-year-old George Avila-Torrez. Months earlier, Avila-Torrez had been arrested in Arlington, Virginia. Avila-Torrez was a Marine stationed at Joint Base Meyer Henderson Hall in Arlington County, Virginia. In February 2010, he attempted to kidnap a 26-year-old woman at knife point in Arlington. She managed to escape and told the police. 2 weeks later, he followed two 23-year-old women who were walking to one of their homes. When the women, who were grad students, stopped in front of the house, he got out of his car, flashed a gun he had in the waistband of his pants, and forced them to enter the home. Inside, he bound them. But one of the women managed to grab a phone and called 911. Avila-Torrez forced her into his vehicle and drove to a wooded area. He sexually assaulted her several times. He then strangled her with her scarf and left her in the snow. The woman survived and managed to flag down a car. Based on the description of the attacker's car, it led the police to Avila-Torrez. They searched his vehicle and found the woman's license and earrings. After he was arrested, the police connected him to the earlier attempted abduction. A sample of his DNA was taken and entered into CODIS. Months later, it was linked to the murders of Laura Hobbs and Crystal Tobias. Avila-Torrez had a connection to Laura and Crystal. He had lived in the same neighborhood in Zion at the time of the murders. He was also a friend of Crystal's older half-brother. Avila-Torrez was 16 years old at the time of the murders. He graduated from high school a year afterward and then joined the Marines. Even though the DNA had been linked to someone who had been arrested for a violent sex crime and was living in the area when Laura and Crystal were murdered, the charges against Jerry Hobbs were not dropped and he remained in jail. Finally, in August 2010, 3 months after being alerted that Avila-Torrez's DNA had been matched to the murders, the state attorney's office dropped the charges against Jerry. Jerry had served 5 years and 3 months in jail without being convicted. Assistant State Attorney Michael Mermel and his boss, State Attorney Michael Waller, still believed that Jerry was the killer. They did not believe the DNA evidence exonerated him. They had just dropped the charges because they couldn't prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Waller said he thought that the DNA was unrelated to the crime. So even though the charges against Jerry were dropped, George Avila-Torrez wasn't charged with the murders. Jerry Hobbs was very disturbed by this. He said, quote, "Why haven't they charged him as fast as they railroaded me?" unquote. After Jerry Hobbs was released, he filed a lawsuit against Lake County, which is where Zion is located. In October 2010, Avila-Torrez went to trial for attacking the 3 women in Virginia. The trial lasted 3 days, and he was found guilty. He was sentenced to 5 life sentences, plus an additional 168 years. Then in May 2011, Avila-Torrez was charged with murder. But he wasn't charged with the murders of Laura and Crystal. In July 2009, 20-year-old Navy Petty Officer 2nd Class Amanda Jean Snell worked at the Pentagon. She was living in Joint Base Meyer Henderson Hall in Arlington. On July 12, 2009, Snell did not show up for her shift. It had been 2 days since anyone had seen or heard from her. A welfare check was performed. Inside her room were her purse and ID. There was a horrifying odor emanating from the closet. In the closet was the dead body of 20-year-old Amanda Snell. She had a pillowcase over her head. She had been dead for about 2 days. On her bed, some semen was found. In 2010, in the lead-up to Avila-Torrez's trial for the attacks on the 3 women in Arlington, he was being held in the Arlington County Jail. In the cell next to him was Osama El-Atari. El-Atari was a former restaurateur who was serving 12 years for bank fraud. He had swindled $54 million from several banks. El-Atari told the authorities that Avila-Torrez had been bragging about the murders he committed. El-Atari agreed to talk to Avila-Torrez while the police recorded their conversations. They got a recording of Avila-Torrez admitting to killing Snell. At the time of the murder, he lived in a room a few doors down from Snell. He entered Snell's room when she was sleeping and attacked her. He bound her with a laptop cord and strangled her to death with his hands. After he confessed, the DNA found on Snell's bedsheet was compared to Avila-Torrez's DNA, and it was a match. This led to him being charged with murder. Avila-Torrez also confessed to El-Atari that he had killed Laura Hobbs and Crystal Tobias. He had killed them with a pocket knife. El-Atari asked him if he felt bad for killing them, and Avila-Torrez said no. Although Avila-Torrez's DNA was found inside Laura Hobbs, and he confessed on tape to killing both her and Crystal, he still wasn't charged with her murders. It turned out that Illinois, especially Lake County, where Zion is located, had a major problem with false confessions and accepting DNA evidence as a tool to exonerate people. On June 6, 2004, Kevin Fox was at home in Wilmington, Illinois, with his 2 children, 6-year-old Tyler and 3-year-old Riley. Wilmington is in Cook County, which is the county that neighbors Lake County to the south. Kevin's wife, Melissa, was out of town for a cancer benefit walk. Early on June 6, Tyler woke up his father and told him that 3-year-old Riley was missing. Kevin called the police and reported Riley missing. Later that day, the dead body of 3-year-old Riley was found in a creek about 4 miles from their home. She had been sexually assaulted and drowned in the creek. No one was arrested in the weeks after the murder. 3 weeks after the murder, the police asked Kevin and Melissa if Tyler could speak to a counselor. They agreed, and Kevin signed a consent form that he had not read. What Kevin and Melissa didn't know was that the counselor was working for the police, and she conducted what was called a videotaped victim-sensitive interview. Tyler cried throughout the interview and said 168 times that his father didn't do anything to Riley. Months passed, and then on October 26, 2008, Kevin and Melissa Fox were asked to come to the police station. They were separated and questioned. Kevin was asked to take a polygraph exam, and he agreed. After completing it, he was told he had failed. Melissa was also told he had failed. Melissa was brought into the room where Kevin was being questioned. Melissa told him that she didn't believe the police and knew he did not kill their daughter. According to Kevin and Melissa, the lead detective physically pulled her out of the room and screamed at her. He also screamed at Kevin that he knew he had murdered his daughter. The police questioned Kevin for 14 hours overnight. It had been more than 24 hours since he slept. He then confessed to the murder of his daughter. He said that her death was an accident. He opened the bathroom door, and the door struck her in the head. He sexually assaulted her to make it look like she was the victim of a sex crime, and then dumped the body. Kevin Fox was charged with murder, and the state attorney's office was going to seek the death penalty. Kevin's brother, Chad, worked in the same building as Kathleen Zellner. Zellner is considered one of the best criminal defense lawyers in the United States and has represented many wrongfully convicted people. At that point, she had got 20 people exonerated. She later became famous when she was hired to help exonerate Stephen Avery, the subject of Netflix's Making a Murderer. Zellner immediately started working on Kevin Fox's case. It turned out that the police never had the DNA tested. so Zellner had the DNA tested with a private lab. It was determined that it was not Kevin's DNA. Kevin was released after 8 months in jail. It turned out that Kevin had passed the polygraph exam, and both he and Melissa were lied to. The police never explained why they didn't have the DNA testing done. The police had also ignored other evidence. For example, another house near the Fox's home had been broken into that same night. Also, a pair of muddy shoes that did not belong to the family was found at their home. Inside the shoes, someone had written the name E.B. The police only had a partial DNA profile of the killer, and at the time they could only upload complete profiles to the state database. So for years, Riley Fox's case was cold. Then in 2009, about 9 years after the murder, the FBI got involved in the investigation. They got a vague tip that a man named Scott Eby may have killed Riley. In 2006, Eby was sentenced to 14 years in prison for raping an adult family member while her husband was in another room. The police got a sample of his DNA and compared it to the partial DNA profile from Riley's murder. It was a match. In May 2010, the FBI interviewed Eby in prison. He admitted to killing 3-year-old Riley Fox. He said that night he broke into a house near the Fox's home and stole a few items and money. After that, he entered the Fox's home through the back door. The lock on the back door was broken. He looked around, but he did not see anything worth stealing. However, Riley caught his attention, so he kidnapped her. He took her to a public bathroom at a park where he sexually assaulted her. He said he decided to kill her after the bandana he was wearing over his face slipped off. In November 2010, 39-year-old Scott Eby pleaded guilty to murder and he was sentenced to life in prison. Although Kevin and Melissa stayed together during the ordeal, they divorced afterward. They filed a lawsuit and they eventually won $8.5 million. In March 2023, Riley Fox's father, Kevin, who was wrongly accused of killing her, died in a car crash in Arkansas, where he lived with his new wife and their kids. He was 46 years old. Months later, in December 2023, Scott Eby, who murdered Riley Fox, died in prison at age 52. Another disturbing case in Illinois, which happened in Lake County, where Zion is located, is the murder of 11-year-old Holly Staker. On the night of August 27, 1992, Holly was babysitting 2 children at an apartment in Waukegan. The woman whom she was babysitting for came home and found the door kicked in. Behind the bedroom door was Holly's body. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, stabbed 27 times, and strangled. The 2 kids she was babysitting were unharmed. For 10 weeks, the case was cold. Then the police received a tip that 19-year-old Juan Rivera had committed the crime. Rivera had a learning disability and an IQ of 79, which is considered borderline to mental impairment. Rivera was questioned for 4 days and he denied doing anything to Holly. Then, on the 4th night of questioning, he nodded when he was asked if he had killed Holly. The police then typed up the confession and Rivera signed it. According to the National Register of Exonerations, the confession made little sense and didn't match the details of the crime. So State Attorney Michael Waller told the police to keep interviewing him until it made sense. Rivera then signed the second confession. Juan Rivera went to trial in November 1993. The only evidence against him were the 2 confessions, which he had since recanted. DNA testing was done on the evidence, and none of Rivera's DNA was found. Also, a pubic hair was found, and an expert said that on a microscopic level, it was not Rivera's pubic hair. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. They found Rivera guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. Rivera's lawyers appealed the conviction. In 1996, the conviction was overturned because the judge held out hearsay evidence and limited the defense's opening statement. Rivera went to trial again in September 1998. This time, the 2-year-old girl Holly was babysitting testified. At the second trial, she was 8 years old. She claimed she remembered the murder and identified Rivera as the killer. She said he had carried her into the other bedroom and she started crying. In Rivera's supposed second confession, he said he carried the girl to the other room and she cried. The prosecution said that was information only the killer would have known. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Rivera was once again found guilty and he was sentenced to life in prison again. His lawyer appealed once again. In early 2005, more DNA testing was done. Specifically, the vaginal swab was tested. The DNA was not Rivera's DNA. So in May 2005, a petition was filed to get Rivera a new trial based on DNA evidence. Over a year later, in August 2006, the judge who presided over the case vacated the guilty conviction and ordered a new trial. Rivera went to trial for a third time in April 2009. Assistant State Attorney Michael Mermel said that the DNA did not prove Rivera was innocent. Instead, he claimed 11-year-old Holly was sexually active and the semen was from her last partner. Mermel never provided evidence that proved the preteen was sexually active. But to prove Holly was sexually active, Mermel brought up embarrassing things about her being sexually curious. Mermel also said that a lab technician could have contaminated the sample. The jury deliberated for 4 days. For a third time, Rivera was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. His conviction was appealed for a fourth time. In December 2011, the conviction was overturned yet again. The appellate court ruled that his conviction was unjustified and could not stand. There was not enough evidence to support a conviction. The ruling was very critical of Michael Mermel and the state's attorney's office. They said that Mermel's theories were, quote, highly improbable, unquote, and he took the evidence to, quote, an absurd degree, unquote. Rivera could not be tried again since his conviction was overturned because of a lack of evidence. So 39-year-old Juan Rivera was released from prison after serving 20 years for a crime he did not commit. The state's attorney, Michael Waller, considered appealing the ruling, and if he won, it would put Rivera back in prison. Another disturbing case from Waukegan happened in July 1994, 2 years after Holly's murder. On July 10, 1994, a woman in Waukegan said she was kidnapped by 2 men who raped her in their car. She described the men and their car to the police. She said they were Hispanic with dark hair. She was 5'7" and said that both men were taller than her. Later that night, the victim, her boyfriend, and the police were at her apartment building. The boyfriend noticed a car in the parking lot about 50 feet away from them, and he told the police he did not think that the car belonged there. The police pulled over the driver, 20-year-old Angel Gonzalez. The car did not match the description the woman gave of the vehicle. Gonzalez also didn't match the description of either man. He was shorter than she described, and he has a distinctive birthmark under one of his eyes. Gonzalez had moved to Waukegan from Mexico 2 years earlier, and he was not fluent in English. He was questioned for 24 hours, mostly in English. Gonzalez claimed he was innocent and he had alibi witnesses. He said he had been watching a movie with his sister and mother at the time of the crime. When he was arrested, he was in the parking lot of the building to drop his girlfriend off. The police never confirmed his alibi with his mother and girlfriend. Instead, they told Gonzalez they had talked to them and they did not verify his alibi. Supposedly, after 24 hours of being interrogated, Gonzalez confessed. The confession was typed in English, and he signed it. In June 1995, Gonzalez was convicted of kidnapping and rape and sentenced to 55 years of prison. But people had a problem with the conviction. Notably, there was no physical evidence. Also, Gonzalez's confession had a lot of inaccuracies. For example, he gave the wrong location where the rape took place. During the interrogation, a Spanish-speaking detective took a statement from him. The statement was then translated into English. However, the English statement was a lot different from the Spanish one. In 2001, DNA testing was performed on the evidence. One man's DNA was found on it, and it was not Gonzalez's. But this was not enough to get Gonzalez a new trial. 2 men had raped the women, and the Lake County State Attorney's Office said Gonzalez was the second man whose DNA was not found. So Angel Gonzalez continued to languish in prison. Yet another problematic case from Lake County happened in 1999. That year, 17-year-old Alejandro Dominguez was convicted of raping a woman in Waukegan. It happened a year earlier when he was 16. Although he was a minor without a criminal record, he was tried as an adult. The victim identified Dominguez as her rapist. A forensic serologist, which is a scientist who studies bodily fluids, testified that Dominguez could not be eliminated as the source of the semen. The judge found Dominguez guilty and sentenced him to 9 years of prison. In prison, Dominguez behaved himself, and he received credit that shaved time off his sentence. He was also credited with time served before he was convicted. So he was released after serving about 4 years. After prison, Dominguez tried his best to move on with his life. He got married and had a child. Then in 2000, the U.S. Immigration Naturalization Service told him they were going to deport him for not registering as a sex offender. He then hired a lawyer to help him clear his name. The lawyer saw many problems with his case. For example, the woman described her rapist as a man who had diamond earrings, a tattoo, and spoke English. Dominguez did not have his ears pierced, he did not have a tattoo, and he only spoke Spanish. Before the woman identified him, the lead detective told her to pay attention to the man sitting in the chair and see if he was her attacker. Dominguez was the man in the chair. Also, the testimony from the serologist was misleading. It was true that tests on his blood, which was not DNA testing, did not exclude him. But the testing only excluded 35% of the population. That meant that 2/3 of all men on Earth could not be excluded. In 2001, it was ordered that new DNA testing would be done. In March 2002, the results showed that the DNA did not belong to Alejandro Dominguez. In April 2002, he was officially exonerated. In October 2006, Dominguez won a settlement of $9 million. Yet another troubling case began in January 1986. A 69-year-old woman went to the police station in Waukegan and told them she was a victim of a terrible attack. She had been walking down the road when she was grabbed by a man and dragged into a ravine. She was then beaten and raped. During the attack, the man bit her shoulder and there was a bite mark. She told the police she had ripped off the man's watch. The police went to the ravine and found the watch, along with a pair of gloves, a black trench coat, and a pair of women's underwear. A receipt from a local dry cleaner was in the coat pocket. The police took the coat to the dry cleaner and learned that it belonged to 26-year-old Benny Starks. Starks' photo was placed in a photo lineup and the victim viewed the lineup. She identified Starks as her attacker. Starks was interviewed and he said that it was his coat that was found at the crime scene. But he claimed that earlier that evening, 2 men had robbed him as he was walking home. They stole his coat, gloves, and wristwatch. However, he had never reported the crime. Starks was charged with aggravated criminal sexual assault, attempted aggravated criminal assault, aggravated battery, and unlawful restraint. He went to trial in 1986. A forensic serologist, Sharon Thomas Boyd, testified that semen was found on the vaginal swab and the woman's underwear. DNA fingerprinting was only used for the first time that year, so no DNA testing was done on the evidence. Instead, the semen was tested for blood type. Thomas Boyd testified that Starks could not be excluded as the source of the semen. A forensic dentist compared Starks' teeth to the photos of the bite mark and testified it was a match. So the evidence against Starks seemed strong. One person who testified on Starks' behalf was an employee with the Illinois Department of Public Aid. She said she had talked to the victim after she identified Starks in the lineup. The victim said she knew he hadn't raped her because she knew her rapist. It was a man who was envious of another man with whom she was in a relationship with. Starks was found guilty and sentenced to 60 years in prison. Starks then contacted the Innocence Project and they took on his case. They had the woman's underwear examined for DNA and found some. It was not Starks' DNA. So in March 2002, the Innocence Project filed for a new trial. In April 2004, there was a hearing to determine if Starks would get a new trial. Assistant State Attorney Michael Mermel argued against the new trial. He claimed the DNA was from a previous sexual partner. He claimed the problem was that the victim had bad hygiene. However, there was a problem with Mermel's statement. At the trial, the victim testified that in the 2 weeks before she was raped, she had not had sex. Mermel essentially said that the woman had said a lot of things, but it didn't matter because all the evidence proved Starks was guilty. He said that if the DNA had been found in the victim's vagina, he would have a different opinion. He said, quote, "I would be standing over there advocating the side that the defense has in the case," unquote. Starks' lawyer requested that the vaginal swab be tested for DNA. Mermel said that was impossible because the swab had been destroyed. The judge ruled that Starks would not get a new trial. Undeterred, Starks' lawyers continued to fight for his freedom. Weeks after the trial, they discovered that a second vaginal swab was at the Northern Illinois Crime Lab. Starks' lawyer wanted to have it tested and asked Mermel to consent to its testing. After all, he did say he would be on the defense's side if the DNA found inside the victim was from someone other than Starks. But Mermel refused. He said they had lost their case and now they were wasting his time. He said his job was, quote, "putting people in prison, not keeping Starks in prison," unquote. Mermel maintained that if DNA was found on the swab, it was probably from a previous sexual encounter. He also said, quote, "We don't have any reason to believe the assailant ejaculated," unquote. In May 2004, Starks' lawyers filed another motion. They found a report from the serologist Sharon Thomas Boyd, who said that Starks could not be excluded as the source of the semen. It turned out she had lied on the stand. The victim was a non-secretor, which means that her blood type can only be determined from her blood and not other bodily fluids like saliva or vaginal secretion. So on the vaginal swab, unless the victim's blood was on it, her blood type could not be determined from it. Starks was a secretor with type B blood. Only type O blood was found on the swab and the underwear. Since the woman was a non-secretor and Starks had type B blood, the bodily fluid had to have come from the rapist. A year later, in April 2005, it was ordered that new DNA testing was to be done on the vaginal swab. Testing revealed it was not Starks' DNA. In March 2006, Starks' conviction was vacated. On October 4, 2006, 47-year-old Benny Starks was released from prison on a $100,000 bond while he awaited his retrial. He had served more than 20 years in prison. The rest of the Starks case fell apart too. The victim had died and could no longer testify. There was also a problem with the bite mark identification. According to Starks' lawsuit, the forensic dentist, quote, intentionally misapplied the methodology they purported to use, employed a method of comparison that has been rejected by the forensic dentistry community, and used flawed preservation and photography techniques, unquote. Still, Michael Mermel and Michael Waller maintained that Starks was the rapist, and they planned on retrying him. In November 2011, the New York Times published an article about the Lake County State Attorney's Office and their problems with accepting DNA evidence that exonerated people. They quoted Michael Mermel from a Chicago Tribune article published the year before, in which Mermel said, quote, "The taxpayers don't pay us for intellectual curiosity, they pay us to get convictions," unquote. Mermel told the New York Times reporter that even though there was DNA evidence linking George Avila-Torrez to the murder of Laura Hobbs and Crystal Tobias, he still believed that Jerry Hobbs was the killer. He had an odd explanation as to how he thought the DNA could have got inside Laura. He pointed out that Avila-Torrez was friends with Crystal's half-brother. He said that perhaps Avila-Torrez was at Crystal's house one day and he masturbated. Mermel said, quote, "They have a popcorn movie night, and the little girl's in the same bed where this guy did it. How do we get colds? We touch our mouths, we touch our nose. What does a woman do after she urinates?" Unquote. He then put his hand near his crotch and pretended to wipe himself. He then said, quote, "Front to back, okay?" Unquote. The article led to a lot of backlash and made people question Mermel's competency. This included the sheriff of Lake County, who called for him to resign. In December 2011, a month after the article was published, Mermel agreed to retire in January 2012 after working for the state's attorney's office for over 21 years. After Mermel resigned, some progress was made on the cases we covered. Mermel's boss, Michael Waller, remained at the state attorney's office and considered appealing the ruling that released Juan Rivera from prison. A month after Rivera was released, Waller announced that he would not appeal the ruling. In 2014, there were two odd twists in Rivera's case. The first involves a piece of supposed evidence. Before Rivera's trial in 1992 for the murder of Holly Staker, the state attorney's office said they had Rivera's shoes with Holly's blood on them. They claimed they got the shoes from another inmate a few weeks after Rivera was arrested. He was being held in a jail where the inmates could wear their own shoes. Supposedly, Rivera had traded his shoes to another inmate for a television and $20. But at all three trials, the shoes were never introduced into evidence. Instead, the only evidence against Rivera were the two highly controversial confessions. Rivera's lawyer wanted to know why they didn't introduce evidence as important as Rivera's shoes with the victim's blood on them. Rivera's lawyer said that the shoes, which were from the sports equipment brand Void, were manufactured in Hong Kong. They were not available for purchase at the time of Holly's murder. When she was killed, they were in a warehouse in California and then later sold in Walmart stores. Rivera's mother said she bought the shoes for him weeks after his arrest. An investigator went to the Walmart where she purchased the shoes, and he was able to get a copy of the receipt, which proves the shoes were purchased after the murder. Rivera's lawyer also knew that the inmate who the police got the shoes from was not the killer. He was in jail at the time of the murder. So how did Holly's blood get on the shoes that Rivera received in prison weeks after the murder? Rivera's lawyer had the Void shoes tested for DNA. Holly's blood was found on them. They also found semen. The semen was a match to the semen found inside Holly, which was from the man who killed her. Rivera's lawyer argued that the police tampered with the evidence to frame Rivera. They got a hold of the shoes from the other inmate and then used some of the evidence to get Holly's blood on the shoes. But, unbeknownst to them, in the process, they accidentally transferred some of the killer's semen as well. According to Rivera's lawyers, There is no other logical explanation as to how both Holly's blood and the killer's semen got on Rivera's shoes that were purchased for him weeks after he had been arrested and placed in jail. It appears that the state attorney's office was aware of the problem with the shoes. 2 months before the trial, the defense had planned to call someone who worked for the importer of the void shoes to testify. Then, at the trial, the shoes were not presented as evidence. In 2015, Rivera's lawyers requested that the shoes undergo more testing. The police department's lawyer argued against this because it could use up the DNA needed for future testing. They also denied any wrongdoing or knowledge of wrongdoing. Rivera filed a lawsuit, and in March 2015, he received a settlement of around $20 million. The second twist that happened in 2014 involves the killer's DNA. In 2014, it was linked to another murder. In January 2000, 8 years after Holly Staker's murder, 39-year-old Delwyn Foxworth lived in North Chicago, Illinois. North Chicago is in Lake County. It is about 4 miles south of Waukegan, where Holly was murdered. On January 20th, 3 men armed with guns forced their way into his house and demanded money. At the time, Foxworth's girlfriend, Delia Connors, was there. Foxworth was punched and kicked. Then the men took turns beating him with a 2x4. The man, who appeared to be the leader, bound Fox with duct tape. The man then splashed gasoline around the room and onto Foxworth. He then started a fire. The 3 men and Delia Connors fled the house. Foxworth managed to put out the flames on himself and got to a neighbor's house. He was rushed to the hospital. 80% of his body were covered with burns, but he survived. Foxworth knew one of the men, the leader. He called him T. Foxworth lived for another 2.5 years. In August 2002, 42-year-old Delwyn Foxworth died from the wounds he sustained in the home invasion. An early suspect in the case was 29-year-old Marvin Tyrone Williford. Foxworth's girlfriend, Delia Connors, identified Williford in the photo lineup. This was the only evidence against him. Williford went to trial in August 2004. The jury deliberated for 3.5 hours and found him guilty. He was sentenced to 80 years of prison. Williford claims he is innocent and was wrongly convicted. He points out that no physical evidence places him at the crime scene. The only evidence against him was Connors picking him out of a photo lineup. Williford found a lawyer who agreed to review the case, and he saw that was very problematic. According to the case files, Williford became a suspect because a detective on the case received a tip from an informant. According to the records, on January 26, 6 days after the home invasion, an informant told the detective that T's real name was Tyrell, but he knew nothing else about the man. Then, 4 days later, the same informant told the detective that T was really Williford, and he gave the detective Williford's date of birth. However, records show that the police started investigating Williford on January 27th. They had requested his booking information, including an arrest photo from the Cicero, Illinois Police Department. This is 3 days before the informant gave the detective Williford's name. In June 2000, there was a grand jury hearing to charge Williford with attempted murder. Before the hearing, the detective showed Foxworth's girlfriend, Delia Connors, a single photo of Williford. She said she believed he was the man known as T. In September 2002, Connors was shown a photo lineup. The lineup contained the same photo of Williford that she was shown before she testified before the grand jury. She identified him as T once again. A warrant was issued for Williford's arrest, but he had left shortly after the home invasion. In February 2003, Williford was pulled over for driving too slowly in South Carolina. The officer did a background check and saw the outstanding warrant. Williford was arrested and extradited to Illinois. Then Connors was shown a second photo lineup. This included the most recent picture of Williford, which was taken after his arrest in February 2003. This time Connors was hesitant to make a selection. She thought that two men might have been T, but she eventually settled on Williford. Williford was the only man to appear in both photo lineups. Something else that was odd was that Foxworth was attacked by three men, but the police never asked Connors to help identify the other two men. Police only seemed to care that Williford was convicted of the murder. In 2013, Williford's lawyers had the 2x4, the gas can, and the duct tape tested for DNA. All three items were used in the murder. They got the results in June 2014. 3 sets of male DNA were found, and none of them belonged to the victim or Williford. A set of DNA found on the 2x4, mixed with the DNA from Foxworth, was a match to Holly Staker's killer's DNA. In 2015, Williford's lawyer filed an appeal to get him a new trial based on the DNA evidence, but the Lake County judge denied the appeal. He said that the DNA evidence did not prove he was wrongly convicted. In 2024, a new appeal was filed requesting that genetic genealogy be performed on the DNA. The new appeal contains a new allegation which explains why at least one detective wanted Williford convicted of murder. The police claim that Williford initially became a suspect because the detective on the case, Lawrence Wade, got his name from an informant. 4 days earlier, the same informant told Detective Wade that the killer's name was Terrell and he did not know anything else about the man. Then on January 30th, he said that Williford was T and he knew Williford's birth date. However, records show that the police were investigating Williford on January 27th. A woman was present when Detective Wade talked to the informant on January 30th. The woman was supposedly having an affair with Detective Wade, who was married. Williford claims that at the time, he was in a sexual relationship with the same woman. Williford's lawyer talked to the woman, and she said after the conviction, Detective Wade said, quote, "That's what he gets for having sex with my girl," unquote. However, the woman refused to sign an affidavit. A hearing for Williford's appeal has yet to be set. At the time of this recording, 53-year-old Marvin Williford is serving a sentence at the Hill Correctional Center in Galesburg, Illinois. The murder of Holly Staker is still officially unsolved. In 2012, the Innocence Project and the Illinois Innocence Project took on Angel Gonzalez's case. Gonzalez was accused of being one of two men who raped a woman in their car. One set of DNA had been found, and it wasn't Gonzalez's DNA. They had the evidence tested again. In January 2015, they got the results. 2 sets of DNA were found, and neither belonged to Gonzalez. In March 2015, Gonzalez's convictions were vacated, and the state's attorney, no longer Michael Waller, chose not to try him again. Like the other men we've talked about, Gonzalez sued. He got a settlement of $9.5 million in July 2018. In May 2012, the Lake County State's Attorney's Office dropped the rape charge against Benny Starks. Michael Waller, who was still the state attorney, planned on prosecuting him for aggravated battery. Waller did not think he could prove Starks had raped the 68-year-old woman, but he believed he had beaten her. Then, in December 2012, before Starks could be retried, Michael Waller announced that after 22 years, he was retiring. He said he had no regrets about how the cases were handled. Waller's predecessor dropped the aggravated battery charges against Starks during his first week. Benny Starks sued and eventually settled for $1.1 million. In May 2012, months after Michael Melmer's retirement and about half a year before Waller's retirement, George Avila-Torrez was charged with the murders of Laura Hobbs and Crystal Tobias. Jerry Hobbs settled his lawsuit in September 2013 for $7.75 million. Avila-Torrez went to trial for Amanda Snell's murder in April 2014. Since Snell was killed in a building that was federal property, he was tried by the federal government. The DNA evidence and his recorded confession were the main evidence against him. Osama El-Atari, who recorded the confessions, testified against him. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Avila-Torrez was found guilty. He was sentenced to death. For cooperating with the investigation, Osama El-Atari only had to serve a third of his 12-year sentence, but his freedom was short-lived. On February 13, 2018, 37-year-old Osama El-Atari was shot to death in a robbery. His murder was unrelated to Avila-Torrez's case, but it did complicate things with the murders of Laura and Crystal. Avila-Torrez's lawyer tried to exclude the recorded confession as evidence because El-Atari could not be present to testify. However, before the trial, Avila-Torrez agreed to a plea deal. In September 2018, 13 years after the murder of Laura Hobbs and Crystal Tobias, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. Instead of being sentenced to death, he was sentenced to 100 years in prison. He was being held at the Red Onion State Prison in Powell, Virginia. As part of the plea deal, he wanted to be transferred to a different prison. According to the Virginia Department of Corrections, Avila-Torrez is incarcerated at one of the state prisons, but it's unclear where. At the time of this recording, he is 36 years old. After being released from jail, Jerry Hobbs moved away from Illinois. The last record of him that can be found indicates he's living in Wichita Falls, Texas. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Please don't forget to check out our new channel, Paranormally Listed. There's a link on the screen now, and there's a link in the description box below this video. Well, that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.